Good afternoon and welcome to today's informational webinar on homelessness. Today's episode is a perspective on veteran services, which will provide an overview of all the resources and programs available for veterans experiencing homelessness in our community. I'm Rick Walk, Community and Economic Development Director for the City of Lacey and Project Manager for the Lacey's Work Group on Homelessness. The work group comprises of a diverse group of Lacey community members appointed by the Lacey City Council with the charge to listen, learn, and discuss the issues of homelessness and ultimately interact with the community and gain the community's perspective to develop a plan and recommendation for the City Council to consider. These particular webinars are intended to provide background and information to the work group and broader community and feature subject matter experts from our region who will discuss current conditions, provide insights to the services available, and offer a variety of perspectives on the topics range from behavioral health, funding, services, housing, and like today, issues related to our veteran community. As always, these programs are recorded and will be posted on the city's webpage for reviewing after the fact. Again, today's webinar topic is veteran services, and our speakers today are Keith Looker, manager of the Lacey Veteran Services Hub, and Sean Liu, who is the Community Engagement Coordinator with Veterans Health Administration Homeless Programs Office. But before we begin, I first want to remind our viewers that our program is formatted with the prepared remarks by our speakers first for the first half, and then we'll open up for question and answer period after they are completed their presentations. And if you're like me, as you hear their presentations, questions will form. And I urge all of our listeners and viewers to, as you think of those questions, to submit them into the chat, because we'll collect those questions and then we'll ask those questions of our speakers in the question and answer format. And again, we'll be using our chat function for the submittal of questions to our speakers. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers and we can move along with our program. First, our first speaker will be Sean Liu, who, as I said, is a community engagement coordinator with the Veterans Health Administration Homeless Programs Office. Sean is as a member of the Office of Community Engagement, he develops, strengthens, and maintains a network of resources through strong partnerships and communications to enhance efforts to prevent and end homelessness among veterans and their families. He also supports the development and implementation of policies, plans, and guidelines and proposals for a variety of VA homeless programs and initiatives, including integrating homeless programs into VA's nationwide suicide prevention efforts, integrating local VAs into their community coordinated entry systems, and identifying and disseminating strong and innovative practices across program operations, and evaluating communications seeking federal confirmation of achieving an effective end to the veterans' homelessness. And this summer, marked Sean's 12th year with working with the VA. In addition, Sean holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Florida International University, a Master of Social Work degree from Florida State University, and is a licensed clinical social worker with the state of Florida. So we're really excited to hear the remarks that Sean's going to provide in providing a broad overview. Our second speaker tonight is Keith Looker. And Keith is the manager of the local Lacey Veteran Services Hub. And so he'll be able to talk today about those programs and services that are on the ground today in the Lacey community. Keith has been managing the Lacey Veteran Services Hub since April of 2017. He is a 32-year veteran of the U.S. Army. Keith has a master's in management and leadership from Webster University and is on the board of directors for Rebuilding Together, Thurston County, and Leaving the Sidelines. He is also an active member of the American Legion and the South Puget Sound Rotary Club. So we're really excited today to have both Sean and Keith here to talk about the issues surrounding homelessness, especially how it affects our veterans community. As we all know, City of Lacey is a very strong and has a strong relationship with Joint Base Lewis McChord, as well as a very integrated veteran community within our community. So we're excited for their presentation today, and I'll hand it over to Sean to start his remarks.
Great. Thanks so much, Rick. Hello, everyone. Really a privilege to be here with you all today. I've got a lot of material to go over and about 10 minutes because we want to make sure that we hear from Keith and have some really, really good Q&A discussion. But just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of some of the topics I'm going to go over today, just provide some really, really, really high-level introductory topics so that we all level set and we're on the same page with similar language of the stuff that we use when we talk about ending veteran homelessness. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the actual criteria and benchmarks for achieving the goal of effectively ending veteran homelessness, largely because it's also to have that end in sight. What are we actually all working towards? Then I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about general coordinated entry principles. Some of this may be familiar, but also going to take it from the standpoint of VA's participation in your local community's coordinated entry system and some of the requirements that we've put on ourselves to make sure that we're good partners. And then last, we'll talk a little bit about some lessons learned and some opportunities for planning and future collaboration. Before I get into a lot of nitty-gritty, though, I do want to say that in these type of meetings or presentations, I try not to get too in the weeds about technical details, largely because what we recognize is that every community is different. You have different resources, you have different players at the table, you have different histories. So to provide too prescriptive interventions for how you should proceed might break your system. So instead, what I want to do is provide you with a series of North Stars to guide you. Some general principles of where how you know that you're going in the right direction, so that you know you're going in the right direction, but can make unique, specific changes and updates to your system based off of your local needs and characteristics. All right. So with that disclaimer in mind, let's continue on just defining a couple terms. When we talk about a homeless veteran, who are we talking about? Now, this may go without saying, but I actually think it's an important thing to define. So when we're talking about homelessness, in this particular instance, we're talking about the federal definition of homelessness found in the McKinney-Vento Act as modified by the Hearth Act of 2009. And that is really talking about sheltered situations or under-sheltered situations and a person who lacks a fixed, regular, adequate nighttime residence. We also take a look at VA for chronic homelessness, not only from an individual standpoint, but also families as well. And this is, of course, if you've been homeless with a disability for at least 1 year or longer in one of these sheltered or unsheltered settings, or 4 times in the last 3 years, where the totality of that experience is a year or longer. The reason why I'm bringing this up is that many members in the community will justifiably ask questions about, well, what do we do about veterans who are doubled up? Couch surfing, especially if they're women or minor children. And you definitely want to make sure that you have responses in place for those. And I do want to acknowledge that a lot of veterans' resources are focused on these specific definitions, right? So we want to be mindful of what we're talking about, especially in the next slide, when we talk about numbers, how many veterans are experiencing homelessness. And of course, we do actually need to define the term veteran as well. And in this instance, it's going to be any adult who served in active duty in the armed forces. Now, this, I want to acknowledge, is separate from VHA healthcare eligibility, and that has implications for program eligibility and enrollment. And the thing I mentioned is that you will have veterans in your community that are not eligible for VA healthcare, but as a community, it's still important to create a response for them, even if they're not going to be using VA specialty homeless program services. So I just want to acknowledge that as well. Let's talk a little bit about the state of veteran homelessness. So what you're looking at is essentially information from HUD's, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's point-in-time count, looking specifically at veterans that were captured and counted during those point-in-time counts. And what we see here is that over the last 10 years, from 2010 to 2009, basically a 50% reduction in veteran homelessness. We don't have the 2020 numbers just yet. We're still waiting for our partners at HUD to get them out. And I do acknowledge that in a couple of weeks, you're going to be doing your 2021 point-in-time count as well. But this is a huge bit of progress. It's not 100%, right? We've got a little bit of ways to go, but it's definitely a huge dent in the number of veterans experiencing homelessness. And I think that's a testament not only to the commitment of our national leaders, but you all as well on the ground and your local day-to-day efforts to work with veterans who are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. All right, I'm going to spend a little bit more time just with some foundational concepts, not a whole lot. This particular graphic is just showing a visual of the different steps along the way in somebody's experience, from housing instability on the far left when they own their own place, to traditional prevention resources, to what we're now considering our rapid resolution interventions. You may have heard terms such as diversion or problem solving before. Of course, the entry into homelessness, and then ideally working with them to rapidly exit them from homelessness back into housing, but if not able to do so, accessing traditional services such as rapid rehousing, permanent supported housing, emergency shelters and the like, or maybe even self-resolution. It's important that as a community that you have responses in place to touch on all of these different aspects of your system. And so as you go forward with your plans, you'll want to make sure and kind of get an inventory of these resources and see if there are gaps. What are some of the ways that you want to advocate to national leaders to make sure that those gaps are filled? This right here, I'm not going to go over it in a lot of detail, but just want to show you a snapshot of the full range of VHA homeless program services that we have for veterans who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. The only thing that I don't actually include here is our homeless patient aligned care teams, or HPACs. This is primary care for veterans who are actively homeless. But you can see that the vast majority of our resources are generally categorized in these 4 different buckets: outreach, engagement, assessment, and referral, those initial stages, residential services, permanent housing, and some of our specialty services as well, recognizing the importance of employment and how the intersectionality of justice involvement for our veterans experiencing homelessness. Of course, I do want to know, I'm going fast. I have provided these slides with the City of Lacey, so they're welcome to disseminate them out. I do have some hyperlinks as well, referencing resources. So if you want to check those out too after the call, please definitely do so. All right, I'm going to provide a high-level overview now of the criteria and benchmarks for achieving a goal, the effective end to veteran homelessness, just so that you know kind of what we're actually looking at on the national level. When a community says they've done the thing, they've ended veteran homelessness, what does that actually look like? A big important reason to do so is to make sure that you have, again, that North Star to guide your work. It is no longer sufficient just to have veterans experiencing homelessness. We need to get them housed and end those episodes of homelessness. But we also want to be clear about what this means on a very, very concrete level, right? We are not saying today, because we do have forces in our economies and our systems that will continue to drive homelessness. So we're not saying that we're going to wave a magic wand and that tomorrow, literally every veteran in your community will be housed. I would love that to be the case. And one day we might get there. But today, what we're talking about is an end to homelessness where we've prevented it whenever possible because we have a systematic response in place. And if it does happen, it is rare, brief, and non-reoccurring. It doesn't happen that very often. For each veteran who experiences homelessness, they don't experience it for very long, and it's just the one time in their lifetime. The other thing that I want to acknowledge when we're talking about this milestone is that achieving the milestone is only part of the process. And so I also want to dispel those myths that we're working ourselves out of a job. We're not doing that either, largely because maintaining this system, keeping the gains, keeping the numbers of veterans experiencing homelessness in your communities low is just as hard, if not harder to do than achieving this particular milestone. So we will all have jobs because there is still much work to be done. All right. What we use as our milestone, we call it the criteria and benchmarks. This framework was developed in partnership with us at VA and our partners at the Department of Housing and Urban Development and the United States Interagency Council on Homelessness. It's actually 2 components: criteria, which are essential elements of your community's response system, which also provides a neat roadmap. So when you think about planning, you can actually use the criteria to actually gauge yourself to see how is your response? How are the services that you are providing in your community? How are you coordinating with each other? Are they working in tandem towards this particular goal? The benchmarks then provide actual numbers, data, outcomes to demonstrate that you actually done the thing as well. Now, I've included a hyperlink right there at the very bottom. Again, these slides have been shared, so they're available after. You can also Google this. If you Google criteria and benchmarks ending veteran homelessness, you'll come to the page, be able to download all the stuff that you want to, if you want to read it in detail. But these are them. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I'm going to provide just a high-level takeaway of what we're talking about here, right? So when you've ended veteran homelessness, you know all the veterans who are experiencing homelessness by name. You can provide shelter to them at any time if they want it, with low barriers to engagement and entry. That you provide service-intensive transitional housing in limited instances, that you have enough capacity to swiftly move veterans into permanent housing, and that you have this capacity in perpetuity, again, being able to sustain. And then you demonstrate this through the benchmarks. So being able to demonstrate with your data that you've actually ended chronic and long-term homelessness, that veterans are able to get housed within 90 days of you knowing that they're homeless, that you have enough capacity for permanent housing, and that the number of veterans that you're able to exit into permanent housing exceeds the number that enter your system. And then finally, that you uphold the principles of housing first and only use transitional housing, service-intensive transitional housing in limited circumstances. I want to acknowledge as well that this is not something that's new, and it's not necessarily that groundbreaking. Since the inception of the criterion and benchmarks in 2015, I believe, we've actually had 81 communities, including 3 whole states, that have achieved an effective end to veteran homelessness. Now, many of them are still working because, as they recognize, and as I mentioned, the work to sustain that is just as hard, if not harder, as achieving the milestone. But it is doable. It is happening across the country. And so we're excited for more communities to kind of opt in and join us in this particular effort. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about coordinated entry principles, why it's so important as part of your planning, and VA's obligations to you as you do go through these different efforts. All right, what is a coordinated entry system? If you're familiar with terms such as VI-SPDAT, it's not the VI-SPDAT. If you have an HMIS system and some forms or stuff in HMIS, coordinated entry is not HMIS. Coordinated entry is actually how we relate to one another as service providers in this common mission of addressing homelessness. And more concretely, it's an approach to coordination and management of our system's resources that allow us to make consistent decisions with the available information and connect people to interventions that will end their homelessness, right? Concretely, what that means, again, it is about assessment. It is about making sure we're assessing people in the same way, but it's also making sure people have the same access, about closing side doors, making it so that an individual can show up at multiple places throughout your system and be evaluated in the same way and have the same access to those resources. But that you're also prioritizing those resources in a way that makes sense so that people who are vulnerable and who need it most get the first access, as opposed to our old systems of first come, first serve. And then most importantly, it is not simply about collecting information on folks and putting them on wait lists, but referrals and entry into actual programs that will address their homelessness. Moving on, I just want to acknowledge one really big kind of cognitive mindset shift for all communities as they move towards coordinated entry. That's moving from a program-centric perspective to a person-centric perspective. What do I mean by that? Well, before coordinated entry, oftentimes we have communities with many different organizations all looking at things from a program or organization-centric perspective. When a veteran enters their doors or calls them on the phone, they ask the question, should we accept this person into our program? What that usually means from a community-wide response is that you have a whole lot of different forms for assessment, program-specific decision-making that may or may not coincide or synergize with other resources in your community, a whole host of ad hoc referral processes, and definitely uneven knowledge about the resources. And actually, a big reason why a lot of these meetings take place over the communities is just to get simple understanding of what resources exist because of this particular way. But as communities move toward implementing coordinated entry and developing robust coordinated entry systems, we shift away from that program-centric perspective and make it person-centric. Of all of the resources in the city of Lacey or in our given community, what is the correct, right, and appropriate amount of resources to address this individual person's needs, right? So that you're synergizing your resources instead of maybe daisy chaining or having them double-dipped inappropriately. What this means, of course, is has some clerical implications, that you're using standardized assessments, that you're all evaluating people who are in need in the same way, that you have an agreement on the forms that you're using as well, that you're collecting data in a similar way, and that you have a coordinated referral process so that it doesn't matter if I see somebody first or if Rick sees somebody first, they're going to be evaluated and have the same amount of access to the resources in the given community. Again, it's a really big shift, and I want to acknowledge that. When it comes to VA's obligation to you in your efforts in integrating ourselves into your coordinated entry system, this is what we're obligated to do. take active participation in your plan. So we're talking about plans today. We absolutely want to be at the table, and we're requiring ourselves to be at the table. That also means we're requiring to participate in your case conferencing, particularly for those case conference meetings where if the system works for the vast majority of the people, but you have a handful of veterans that actually need some extra TLC, we need to be at that table providing information and helping to solve those problems. Now, we're also making sure that your list of known veterans in your community is up to date with the information that we have, so that any veteran that we see who's homeless that you're aware of as well. Utilization of your common assessment tool, dedicating specific resources to you, and of course, data sharing. There's more information in the link at the very bottom of your screen. It goes to HUD's website, but it'll actually get into a little bit of detail from our policy memo that set these requirements, so you can check them out. Other resources here, I won't go into them, but you can click on any of these links if you get a copy of the slides after, and it'll take you some of the other HUD resources. You can also just take a screenshot and Google these too. I've kept the headings appropriate. All right, the last little bit before I'll turn it over, because my time is almost up, just want to talk about some of the opportunities for planning and collaboration. We've learned a lot from VA over the last 2 or 3 years when we've started putting out coordinated entry guidance, and really gained a deeper understanding and appreciation for what happens on the local level. And one of the things that I'm most proud of with our coordinated entry policies and technical assistance that we provided, that it's been very responsive to the needs of people on the ground and really addressing what their issues are. I want to recognize that integration in this development, it takes time. It takes a lot of shared learning. I spout off and mouth off constantly, but I actually don't have all the answers. A lot of what I can know and share is just the things that people in the community have figured out over time. And so we have to approach this work with a spirit of shared learning, of shared understanding, that we're going to show grace and kindness to one another as we figure this process out. And that when we set a plan, there's a decent chance that that plan is going to be updated multiple times, so that we're going to iterate, we're going to keep coming back to the table and keep modifying our plans to make sure that even when we think we've got things set, there's still probably improvements to be made because our veterans deserve it. I just want to put this here in terms of if you're establishing initial contact with some VA staff or for any other service providers, for any other disciplines, just some basic steps in regards to setting up the conversations. I usually include these even though most people know them already, but it's helpful as reminders. And again, the really, really critical bit here is that coordinated entry in these efforts to end homelessness are really about how we relate to one another and we work together. So sometimes having it laid out like this is actually kind of helpful. And we just want to anticipate that we're going to keep coming back to the table, tweaking and updating and modifying our plans based off of new resources, changing realities. I mean, we're still in a pandemic, so want to acknowledge that. One more little bit here. This is more for your resource, just for awareness. If you want to check these out, just going into some concrete details about establishing different relationships and communication as you're developing your plans. And then the very, very last thing that I want to do is actually leave you with a repository of some concrete best practices. As Rick mentioned in my bio, I am part of a work group that identifies and disseminates strong practices. We write them up as white papers and we post them online. The link is below. Definitely encourage you to check them out. There are a couple that we're really proud of, including one paper on how the Commonwealth of Virginia ended veteran homelessness statewide, and one other one that talks about integrating grant and per diem programs into your coordinated entry system. So if you're especially looking for transitional housing, but a lot of other neat topics as well. That's all for me. Looking forward to answering your questions after we hear from Keith. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Sean, and that was a fantastic presentation. And thank you for mentioning, and I'll remind our attendees that the materials that PowerPoint slide that Sean used with all the links will be posted on Basecamp and sent out to the work group members for a further resource. So with that, I'll turn over to Keith. And Keith, will you be able to tell us a little bit about the localized perspective?
I sure can. So good afternoon. I'd like to thank you guys for inviting me to be part of this group here. So I've been at the hub now for about 4 years. And one of the goals of the Lacey Veteran Services Hub was to try to consolidate services under one roof to make it easier for veterans to get these services. One of our primary programs that we started out with was our housing program, because that was a big push for the city that understood that there was a large population of homeless veterans in this area, We wanted to try to see if we can help curb those numbers down. So in the last 4 years, we've actually put over 500 veterans into housing here. So one of the things that we did as part of our program is we wanted to make sure that we had services that supported all the veterans. As Sean had mentioned, some of the programs through the VA had certain requirements that you had to have a certain type of discharge from the military, or you had to have be eligible for enrollment in VA healthcare. And we understood that some of the veterans in our community weren't going to fall into that category. So we tried to bring in other resources. So what we currently have down here is we have some federal resources. So the VA's housing office for Thurston County operates out of here, and they handle a couple of different VA grants. We work with the state Washington Department of Veterans Affairs, which provides some housing services. And then we have several nonprofits that either have received different grants to try to help to get homeless and homeless veterans into housing. What I want to kind of cover is the different types of housing that we actually have here. So the first one is what we call transitional housing. And that can go anywhere from some of the shelters will provide 90-day beds for a veteran to stay in while we work with them to try to get them opportunity to get into a more permanent type of housing. And so our Salvation Army and the Drexel House both have those kind of services. And the Washington Department of Veterans Affairs maintains a homeless house up at Port Orchard, up at Retzel, and out at Ording. We also have more of a long-term transitional housing that falls under the VA's grant per diem program. So this allows a veteran to stay within this program for 2 years and gives supportive services to help them battle whatever their demons are that they need in order to stay and get into a permanent housing. We have a couple of supportive housing units that are just veteran specific. And there are the DeVoe and the Billy Frank Jr., which are built through grants, and they assist veterans for long-term supportive housing to help provide them either with the job training or counseling or drug rehabilitation, whatever the services are, so they can move into to regular housing. We also have several permanent housing programs. 2 of them are through the VA. So they have the HUD-VASH program and the supportive services for veterans families. They're each kind of designed for a specific target audience. But what they can use those funds to put them into any housing unit within the community, so they're not restricted to a special type. It's just wherever there's an opening, they can get into that. They also have what they call rapid rehousing funds, which is a short term, which kind of helps out if you have a family just has a job, but they, for some reason, temporarily became homeless and just need some assistance to help pay those move-in costs, to help get them back on their feet. So we can use those also. Some of the challenges that we've had here in our community, one is, of course, it's a challenge across the board, is a lack of housing. And so even though we have several veterans that are in these programs, they're eligible to move into housing, but there's just no housing available in the market for them to move into. Another problem we have with that is so we base them through our coordinated entry on what we consider to be the most vulnerable population. And they're usually our priority in trying to get those individuals into housing because they have been homeless for long periods of time. Some of the veterans we have come in here have been living on the streets for almost 20 years. And so, for one reason or another, they need some kind of assistance to get them into that. Unfortunately, what goes along with that, a lot of times they have items in their history that would make them harder to get them into housing. Either they have had bad credit, they've been evicted from housing, they may have a criminal record. And so so not only is there a shortage of housing, but also just trying to find housing that would take those kind of clients has always been a big challenge for us. Some of the problems we have with the veterans is they're very nomadish. We have some that came from this area and they'll stay here Others, they kind of go where the services are at. Unfortunately, in this area here, due to the lack of housing, when I first started, it was averaging about 4 months to get a veteran that came in through the process and get them into permanent housing. We now have several veterans that have been on that list for over a year, so they're now listed, considered to be chronically homeless, simply because there was just no housing that we can put them into. We have a newer class now due to our current housing market, is that a lot of the homeowners are now selling their homes. And so they were renting them at that time. And so the veteran families are coming out because the house is now for sale. We're not able to locate housing for them. So those families are also starting to become homeless and living on the streets. And then, a lot of it, and because COVID has kind of taken a lot of the veterans, a lot of the homeless period, and have forced them to consolidate into areas where they feel it's safe for them. So I'm sure, as most of you know, if you drive up I-5, you'll see that a lot of the homeless have left the cities and are now kind of residing in small camps on state property or outside of the eye of outsiders, where they figure that it's safer for them in their smaller communities to protect them from the COVID. So it's kind of a little bit harder process to get them even to come forward and look for those services. I think as far as our future, I think once we resolve the issue of how we're going to provide more housing in our community, with the programs we're going to have and the support, we have a whole bunch of great providers here that work together from all levels and every day, just to do everything they can to try to put these guys into housing. And so I think once that housing becomes available, we'll be able to make an additional mark. And our goal has always been to get rid of veteran homelessness in our community, and so that's a goal we continue to work forward. I think that's pretty much all I had for you guys.
Great, thank you, Keith. That was a great overview of what the local experience is like. So now we're going to transition into our question and answer portion. And I just want to remind all of our attendees, if you do have a question, please submit that in through the chat, and then I'll moderate those questions to our speakers. And I want to start off with the question for Sean. On your slides, you had a nice little graphic early on that showed that downward trend in homelessness amongst veterans from 2010. What are the causes of that downward trend? Was it related to tracking data, or is it related to programs, or would you say is what initiated that downward trend in the decline of homelessness over those 10 years?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And I think it's hyper relevant, and it shows the importance of a lot of different things. Number one, an injection of resources. So around that time, we saw a huge increase in our HUD-VASH permanent supported housing program, primarily with the injection across the country of housing choice vouchers specific to veterans, as well as staff to actually provide the robust permanent supported housing wraparound services. Another thing that we actually saw was the start of the Supportive Services for Veteran Families program, which I know it came into my community around 2013, but that actually also created another injection of resources focused on permanent housing, specifically for what I have interpreted to be a wider band of what we call acuity, or kind of more moderate needs, which make up a decent chunk of the veteran population. So when we actually see those two big injections of resources, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. I want to also say that around we get into 2014 and 2015, you actually also start seeing the adoption of these milestones towards ending veteran homelessness, and a really, really big important focus on the use of data to actually evaluate your progress, whether it was from VA side to actually use our data to try to identify the gaps and make sure that we were appropriately allocating the resources, or if it was going to be with communities that were moving away from simple HMIS program enrollments and PIT count data to starting making by name lists. so that you get an actual active number of how many veterans are in their community. The other thing that I think is really, really important to contribute to our success in the veteran sphere is the adoption of housing first as well, which both as a operating philosophy, but also specific program interventions are huge in terms of driving those numbers, specifically in informing how we direct those resources that we inject into our communities to specific veterans. So when we actually look at the injection of resources, using data to inform operations, approaching it from a housing first principle, you just see this massive reduction in veteran homelessness. The other part too that I want to acknowledge though, 50% is not 100%. So we still have more ways to go. What that means going forward is that we need to continue to use, as Keith mentioned, these coordinated entry principles to make sure that we're getting the best use out of the resources in our systems, to make sure that now that we've injected so many resources across the country, that we're not only using them appropriately, but the communities still have what they need. And then the really, really big bit that I think is going to be next level that a lot of communities are starting to grapple with is this term of inflow, specifically of how do we influence the circumstances in which a veteran becomes homelessness. Right now, it kind of goes without saying that inflow feels a little bit like its own force of nature, like it's a hurricane or an earthquake, something that we don't have control. But there actually are efforts now with many communities who have a mature coordinated entry systems to start really looking at addressing inflow, whether it's through principles like diversion or problem solving, making sure that individual clients are exploring all of their options before they get into the homeless service system, or from some other larger scale interventions such as effective eviction prevention or other upstream circumstances.
Great. That's great to hear too, but balancing, because we always focus on what we see invisible and trying to be reactive, but also that part of the effort to intersect or resolve homelessness is to go upstream and be proactive and try to create some diversion before they get into that emergency situation for themselves. Thank you. And just as a follow-up too, I noticed there was a slide there that talked about across the state, many communities have categorized ended homelessness in the 3 states. How are those communities working with the VA or other programs for veteran services to help in that homelessness? And out of curiosity, do you know which community in the state of Washington has been successful?
Yeah, I just looked that one up and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, so please absolutely correct me. It was Kittitas County? Did I say that right?
Kittitas County.
Kittitas. Okay, yeah, it was that county that ended veteran homelessness. I apologize, I don't have the exact year that they did it. In basically all of the instances, it wasn't just a community that had strong partnerships with VA, but it had strong partnerships and collaboration overall. In many instances, when a community actually submits, it is local city leader or county leadership, whether it's the mayor, county commissioners, somebody from the actual municipality that actually is putting forward the application, and they're doing so in part often with their continuums of care and their VA as well. And one of the things that we actually strongly look at as a member of the review team is that if there's not evidence of strong VA involvement, that actually is a strike against, right? Because we recognize VA, not just through our supportive services for veteran family programs, which has been a huge, huge benefit along with our grant and per diem programs in terms of our partnership at VA with the community, but also with our HUD-VASH permanent housing program and our outreach and our healthcare infrastructure. If that partnership and collaboration isn't in place, we oftentimes don't actually certify a community.
Great, thank you. This next question is maybe, Keith, you can take a look crack at it from the local perspective, and then Sean from a program perspective. But one of the questions came in is a major issue is willingness of a homeless person to be helped, their acceptance of that help. How does your program deal with it, and how do you work with somebody that may not want that help but needs that help?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's kind of like you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So yeah, we run into that quite a few times where individuals come in and you can tell that they need help, they're struggling, but they're just not at that point yet. Sometimes you just got to wait until they hit rock bottom and they decide, hey, I'm done and I need some help. We continue to work with them. We still try to touch base with them, once a week or once a month. We provide, some of our wraparound services to make sure they're getting their VA benefits, or if they need health care or drug and alcohol counseling, mental health counseling, uh, and employment. Anything we can do to just kind of maintain contact with them and try to get them to that point where they're ready to say, hey, you know, I'm tired of living this lifestyle, and I want to, I want something more permanent. And that's really about all you can do, is just be there for them until they're ready to take that step.
Sean, in the program perspective, how's that work? You mentioned a couple of things about coordinated entry system and building relationships, but also there's the housing first model. Is there any relationship there?
No, it's a huge relationship. And I both have, interestingly, a spicy hot take that I feel really good being on record at a recorded city meeting. It's actually twofold, right? So number one, it's making sure on an individual level that we're practicing different principles such as motivational interviewing techniques or assertive engagement, and that we keep going back to veterans or people who are experiencing homelessness, that we don't give up and we build relationships. Relationships are huge, right? It's for many veterans, it's about trust. It's about maybe potential betrayals that they feel from the federal government. So it's about actually creating those relationships, building trust, building buy-in, and recognizing what their needs are. But that recognizing what their needs are is the appropriate second step, which is on our end, both as a national program office and then individual programs across the country, is that we are providing resources and designing our programs responsive to what our clients want. In many instances, it's understandable that if we create an array of services that we think people want, but they actually don't want it, they're not going to get it. And one of the things, the important lessons about housing first that we recognize over time, that it's not, and I want to be clear, housing first is not housing only. There is literally no one in VA who thinks it's good to just give somebody, especially if they're vulnerable, a housing resource and then provide literally no support. So I do want to be clear about that. But some of the things that we learned over time is that it's incumbent upon us to understand what our clients want and need from their perspective, and then as much as humanly possible, update and adjust our services to provide the services that they want. And so when we have that twofold component, an array of services that are responsive to the needs as they describe it to us, and then this ongoing commitment to continue to come back to them. Not today, I'm coming back tomorrow, I'll bring a sandwich. Not today, I'll come back, I'll see you tomorrow again. And keep going until their answer is yes. Then we can prevent them from having to go to rock bottom. The thing that I want to say about rock bottom, and this comes from my old clinical supervisor who was recovering from alcoholism. And he said, Sean, rock bottom for many people is actually a point that is way, way, way past death. If at all possible, we want to avoid people to getting to rock bottom, because their actual rock bottom, they may not live to actually get that far. And so if we keep coming back to the table, but also making sure that our services are things that they tell us they want, we can actually motivate them and get them into our housing. And it's a win-win for all.
Great, thank you. Keith, you mentioned in your presentation, which was interesting and staggering, actually, the fact that when you started working, there was once a 4-month waiting list for somebody to access housing and to get them off the street. And now it's extended over to 12 months. That really speaks to some of the resources out there. But with that waiting list in mind, has a number of Thurston County veterans who are homeless, has it declined, or the number have increased in your observations over the last several years?
Well, the number is kind of fluid. So when we started out, when I started 4 years ago, we had 125 veterans that were on our master list that we were tracking. We're currently down to about 65, but it kind of fluctuates. So one of the problems is so veterans fall into different categories of why they become homeless. Some have, mental health or drug addiction, or, they've had long-term chronic homelessness that they're dealing with. We have some that are just, it was just bad luck. They lost their job, they weren't able to pay their rent or something. And so, and around here, especially for a while, we had a lot of veterans because of the conflict, were suffering from PTSD. And they refused to acknowledge the fact that they had a problem until it got to the point that They either had lost their job from that, or they're involved in a domestic violence situation. And so where they actually sat on that list of vulnerability varied. So, if you had just lost your job and you didn't have a lot of other chronic issues, your vulnerability would have been lower. And said the priority always was those individuals that have the high vulnerability issues, that we're trying to get those guys into some kind of a supportive housing, so we can keep them, off the streets and try to make their lives better. So that made it just harder for those guys that were farther down the list to get those resources. And so, we rely a lot on, the city, does that fundraiser once a year, where people were donating funds to go to the hub. So we were using that funding to kind of help those veterans that were in that lower vulnerability, that just needed someone to help them out with paying their moving costs. And they could have a job, they just needed to get set up back up again. And so, so as a taller, and they have the more issues, so it's harder to get those guys at the top of the list into housing now, either because of their backgrounds or just lack of housing that we have here. And so it's just kind of delayed that process to get them where we can get them a voucher or find a place that they can move into that they can afford.
Thank you. And the next question I have, we throw it out to either one of you. It's a question on definition. Is permanent housing defined as unsubsidized or permanently subsidized housing?
So I'll touch on that really quickly. The thing I want to impress upon you is twofold. Number one, when we're talking about definitions, I do want to encourage folks to get in the habit of, for the purposes of, that words mean stuff, but they usually mean stuff for some kind of purpose. And so for the purposes of the criteria and benchmarks, and for the purposes of, say, VA's performance outcomes, or maybe say HUD's performance outcomes, when we talk about permanent housing, we are actually talking about both subsidized and unsubsidized locations. And I can rattle off the list real quick. It's either going to be home ownership, whether that's subsidized or not, rentals, whether it's subsidized or not, or permanently residing with family or friends, like you've become a roommate. Other circumstances would not be considered permanent housing. And the main thing where it comes up a lot is going to be living with family or friends on a temporary basis. So I do want to distinguish roommates versus couch surfing.
Yeah, and I kind of echo that. So we have our supportive services for veterans families. That and the rapid rehousing are short-term funding resources, kind of just help them get back on their feet. The HUD VASH program is actually it's a cooperation between the VA and the Housing Authority. So it's kind of up to the Housing Authority on how long those individuals are using those vouchers. So yeah, it could be subsidized for a long period of time, or it could be just a short period that they subsidize their housing, and then they move on into taking care of themselves.
Great. The question I have next is, I think it's in reference to, Sean, that reference to the slide of showing the downward trend in homeless services. And I think one of our recalled seeing it flattened out in about 2016. Do you have any perspective on the causation of that, maybe?
I do. Nothing totally official. So I am getting into slight, not quite speculation territory, but I'll talk about some of the trends that were happening at the time. So one of the things that we heard a lot from staff, especially as we got into 2015, 2016, 2017, was oddly kind of a good thing, which was a recovery of the housing market, but more specifically that it was harder to actually find affordable housing units. Specifically, that units would be affordable within, as Keith mentioned, our HUD VASH permanent housing voucher subsidy or SSVS subsidies. It just got, in many communities, those units were harder to find. We also experienced from VA side, actually the federal government side, a hiring freeze that happened for a while. And as we kind of recognize that if we're going to help veterans and anybody who's homeless get into housing, we actually need physical staff to do it. And so we heard a lot from medical centers across the country that staffing needs were also at issue. Another big bit, what I do want to say is not hugely responsible, but is something that happened. And I think it's an important shift. So I do want to be on the record in saying that is that VA shifted to make suicide prevention its #1 priority. And I do want to be clear, that was a very important move. The number of veteran suicides is very, very bad, and we need to reduce that quite a bit. And, changing with that shift, all of the other things that follow. We've done a really, really good job of making sure that homelessness integrates with suicide prevention efforts. And some of the things I'm actually proud of is that some of the research that has been put out recently that looks at the intersectionality of homelessness and suicide recognizes, #1, those risk factors are basically the same. But #2, in many instances, homeless services act as de facto suicide prevention interventions, which I think is just a fantastic idea.
Great. Thank you. So this next question, and it's a question that, as I've gotten involved in this conversation with homelessness and more steeped in it, I've heard a lot about the housing first model, and there's been a lot of, I guess, pros and cons or different perspectives on it. Can you speak to maybe that contradiction of why some people think it is a great model and
100%.
don't think it's a great model, and what your take is on those contradictions?
Yeah. In contrast to before, I'm not going to give the spicy hot take, but I'm going to try to thread the needle appropriately and give a very measured response. I think at the end of the day, housing first is an important model, and it's complex. For many folks, it goes against a lot of our intuitions about needs and how people navigate through the world. And it requires a lot of support, both from a financial standpoint to appropriately staff programs to provide the appropriate level of services, and the actual clinical skills for the clinicians working with the clients, right? So when you look at all of that, and this is where it's important to get into the difference between housing first and housing only. Housing first is not housing only, it is housing first and then the wraparound services. Some of the things that we learned about the research is, and this comes up a lot when we think of things of housing first as a failure, is in the area of substance use. And what a lot of the research shows is that while housing first is not better at addressing substance issues, it's not necessarily worse either. It's about the same as other interventions. And in some instances, it actually doesn't curb alcohol use or drug use. And for many, despite the fact that somebody may still be housed, that could be considered a failure. And so there's probably some of that feeding into the misunderstanding. As I mentioned before, it is an actual advanced type of model that does require a lot of support at all levels to implement well. And I think the last thing that I want to mention, especially as somebody who's run a housing first program and have worked with a lot of different staff to make the shift from a housing ready to a housing first approach, is that in contrast to other potential models and approaches, housing first does an amazing job of getting people housed and keeping people housed, right? And I do a lot of times for my staff who experience their own frustrations that although the veterans that they work with stayed housed, had difficulty navigating VA services, were exhibiting, especially for the first year or so, similar levels of either their symptoms remaining, they're not seeing improvements in functioning, they were still staying housed. And that can be kind of frustrating. And it's important as supervisors and program managers that we provide the appropriate support to our staff, along with training, along with program models. But I think, the thing from VA side, the evidence is very clear in our data. We've seen a 50% reduction in veteran homelessness, and that not only coincided with the injection of resources, but that adoption of the housing first principles, which I believe happened VA-wide around 2012.
I hear too that it's not just like I said, the important part of that is the wraparound services, that support structure going
the critical part, the most important part. And that's where things can go a little bit iffy if it's not supported appropriately. And I do want to be very, very clear. Nobody at VA thinks it's a good idea that we give the most vulnerable people we're working with a housing resource and just say, good luck, have fun. No, we are committed to providing those wraparound services.
Great. Thank you, Sean. We got a few more questions, and we're coming up against our hour mark. So we'll see if we can get through these last 4 questions, and then we'll maybe have one final wrap up. Next question is maybe this is something you can hit up on. What approaches should a community like Lacey take to meet the needs of vets that have past issues that make them hard or impossible to place? how do the communities that have ended vet homelessness deal with this?
That's actually a kind of a good question. So some of the issues that they have are issues that all homeless have. It's like some of them. So if like you have an arson, a past history, or you've been have a felony arrest for arson, or if you are have a sexual assault charge against you, individuals like that, it is a struggle. That I mean, we very seldom do we find, and usually it's an individual who's willing to kind of look the other way and say, hey, you made a mistake, and we're going to give you a second chance to get up here. But a lot of the larger complexes, that's, they won't even consider that. In some cases, I think maybe like we have affordable housing programs is maybe offer some kind of state incentive or federal incentive to say, hey, we realize we're taking a larger chance because we're going to accept somebody who has, bad credit, or they've been evicted from that. And so, we understand there's a risk, but, if you reach out and take those kind of clients in, we'll, we'll make it kind of worth your while. So, so a lot of it has to do is when they have to pass that background check, like if you have a credit score of less than 600, you're not going to pass most of these backgrounds. Another problem we have here is because of apartments and the housing is so expensive, is that require you to have 3 times the income in order to qualify to move into the apartments. Some of the senior housing has kind of reduced that to 2 times that income, but it's very hard with when you're looking at an apartment that's $1,500 to $2,000 a month. That's a lot of money you have to be bringing in order to qualify for that. So I think some kind of incentive to encourage apartment complexes to make it worthwhile to take individuals that fall into that class would be helpful.
Okay. What resources open up for veterans that are diagnosed with mental, emotional issues such as PTSD?
Yeah, there are actually a lot of, so just from the VA standpoint, there are a lot of resources for veterans at their local VA clinic. We also have various residential programs as well, if that's appropriate. I think the main thing is about making sure that veterans are aware that those resources are available and get connected with their local VA hospital. But we have a whole host from our outpatient mental health clinic to inpatient residential programs as well. Definitely can check it out. And we are nationwide, so veterans can and do, and we support veterans, if they need to temporarily relocate because the best program is a little bit further away, we can support that.
Yeah, so we encourage, of course, we use the VA healthcare system. So I'll send them veterans up to American Lake to get counseling. We're also co-located with a vet center, which is another VA counseling service. So they can come here. We work with different resources in the community. Like we have the Cohen Clinic up in Lakewood that provides services for military and veterans. And they also have a grant that they can help out veterans that they don't have insurance to get the kind of services. We work with to get veterans onto, if they don't have VA healthcare, to get them onto Medicaid. And we have several organizations here that provide mental health services that accept Medicaid. And then of course the VA has a community care network where you can local vendors can get approval to treat through the VA system. And so that gives them opportunity to see a local provider without having to travel. So we try to use all the resources that are available to get them the help that they need.
Great, thank you. And Sean, in your presentation, you talked about the coordinated entry program. I know we have a coordinated entry program here locally. So Keith, as a Veteran Services Hub, can you confirm that you guys are participating in a coordinated entry program, or if you are or not, and who is that lead?
Yes. So and a lot of it has to do with the providers. So, it's kind of an agreement that everybody has, is that coordinated entry is probably the best step that we have right now for getting these guys in. So in Thurston County, we actually have 3 different organizations that manage coordinated entry. So we have the Community Action Council, we have the Family Services, South Sound Family Services, and then we have Children and Youth Services. And they manage, we actually have 5 different coordinated entries lists that we do here within the county for either singles, families, uh, uh, individuals under 24. And then we have a veterans coordinated list, and then a coordinated list for domestic violence survivors. So that all within those 3. And we actually have a 1-800 hotline number that we give everybody who's looking for coordinated entry, and that automatically routes them to the proper organization to get them on that list and make sure that they're getting sent to the services that they require.
Great. Well, and thank you, Keith. And then we have this one last question, which is related to what is the definition of affordable housing for the city of Lacey area. I'll take that in the sense that the affordable housing definition is really a formula. What we go by is a formula developed by the Housing, Urban and Development Agency, and it's basically based on income and a local median household. And so I can provide that information to the work group offline and give you those definitions of what affordable housing is on a technical measure. But then, of course, we know that housing affordability is also a personal issue, not just a formula as well. So there's those 2 factors in place. So I'm going to wrap up with that and have one final question for you, and it's related to with the work groups, their work on developing a plan for the city of Lacey to respond. Of course, we're focused on veterans today, but if you guys, as a final thoughts, maybe share what you would either recommend or suggest or would like to see how homeless is addressed, whether it be veterans specifically or the general broader category of homelessness, in the plan that the work group develops ultimately and recommends to our city council.
I think from my take, make sure that your local VA is looped in early and often. I do want to acknowledge they're listening in on the call, and they did want to mention that there's a wonderful residential recovery treatment program that's in the area as well for the question about mental health. But make sure your VA is looped in. We definitely want to be fantastic partners with you. I've already mentioned them to this call, so they're definitely ready to go. But the other part is download the criteria and benchmarks, read it over as a community, check it out. Again, as you're making your plans, that can be an important North Star along with our coordinated entry guidance as well. And then the last bit is that as you identify needs, especially if their needs are resource needs or issues in regards to regulations or statutes, that's something that we want to hear from your regional leaders as well to get it up to the chain, because we want to make sure that in your work, you have all the tools you need to get the job done.
Yeah, I think I would just continue on this. So, right now I think we have a great partnership between all the different resources, the VA and the state, the county, and the local nonprofits. We just have to find a housing to put these individuals in. And I think once we are able to resolve that, I would mention, so I was working with Los Angeles County, and at the time they actually have like the highest number of homeless and homeless veterans there. And they actually they hired USC to come in and do research. And based off that research, they determined that it was actually cheaper in the long run for them to build housing and provide housing for these individuals than what it was costing us in just the social programs between healthcare, emergency room treatment. There's all the programs, incarcerations. And so that's the direction they went, that they actually have the different communities are building housing units specifically for these individuals. So I think if we can come up with some kind of incentive or some kind of plan that we can just provide more housing in this community, that I think that with all the great resources that we have, that this will self-resolve itself.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to, in respect of time, and I want to express my sincere appreciation for both Sean and you, Keith, to being able to take this time, this a little bit over an hour, to spend with us to inform our work group on this important work that they are doing for the Lacey community. As they work on this, it's encouraging to see the efforts and resources that have been put forth by your programs there at the Veterans Health Administration and at the local Lacey Veterans Hub. seeing some of those programs and some of those stats. I hope we can translate some of that success that we're seeing, down into the local community, not only for the homeless population, but the overall homeless population in our community as well. So hopefully we can use that as an example, and we'll keep you posted of our progress. We are going to have a virtual open house later this month, and so we'll make sure you have invites. So if you want to, no matter where you are in the country, you'll be able to access, you can see what progress and what some of the guiding principles and goals that they are developing. So with that, again, my sincere thanks for you taking the time to spend with us, and really valuable information that you've provided for our work group to chew on. To our audience and our work group, just a reminder that this information, both the webinar as well as the materials, will be posted on Basecamp and on the city website, so you can review those materials again. And that if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, and I can get you to that information as well. There were a few other questions that came in after I closed down the question period, but we'll see if I can work with Keith to provide some written response to those questions, so we make sure we have all those inquiries answered. So with that, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar series to be scheduled soon. Have a good day.